Is this possibly a break in the case? There was a SWAT raid, which I was actually at. They went into a neighborhood about 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's house in Tucson, and they detained a man and a woman from the house, and they also detained a man from a traffic stop at a Culver's restaurant very close to that house. That the sheriff's office is saying that inside Nancy Guthrie's house, they located DNA that does not belong to Nancy Guthrie and does not belong to anyone associated with Nancy Guthrie, okay? So a stranger's DNA located in the house.
I have a one-word answer. That's outrageous. And it's outrageous for a number of reasons. The FBI is the entity that certifies those for-profit organizations, of which the Sheriff's Department here has a contract with, to analyze trace evidence, DNA, hair, anything.
Early that morning, investigators received confirmation that a coordinated law enforcement operation had already taken place just miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. But what led to that operation began with something found inside her house. By the end of this video, you will understand what triggered that response, why multiple individuals were detained, and how a single piece of forensic evidence began to change the direction of the entire case. Everything in this video is based on publicly available information, law enforcement statements, and verified reports. Where details remain unclear, that will be stated directly. Now here's where things begin. Nancy Guthrie was reported missing late on a Tuesday evening. According to investigators, the report came from someone close to her, someone who described her disappearance as completely out of character. She had a routine. People who knew her say she checked in regularly. She responded to messages. She followed predictable patterns. There was no indication she intended to leave without explanation. That detail mattered immediately. When officers arrived at her residence, there were no obvious signs of forced entry. The home appeared undisturbed. Personal belongings were still inside, including items she would normally take if she planned to be gone for any length of time. Think about that. Someone does not simply leave their home and disappear without taking the essentials. That was the first indication that something may have interrupted her normal routine. Investigators secured the scene and began reconstructing her timeline. According to reports, Nancy was last seen earlier that same day. A neighbor stated they saw her outside in the afternoon. There was nothing unusual about her behavior. No signs of distress. No indication that anything was wrong. But after that point, the timeline becomes limited. No confirmed sightings. No outgoing communication. No financial activity. This is where things begin to shift. Law enforcement started reviewing digital evidence. Phone records. Nearby surveillance cameras. Doorbell footage from surrounding homes. One clip reportedly showed Nancy moving toward her vehicle. The timestamp aligned with the neighbor's statement. But there was a detail investigators focused on. The vehicle did not leave immediately. According to investigators, it remained parked longer than expected. That delay became a point of interest. Now here's what matters. That gap suggested that something may have occurred before she ever drove away. It introduced the possibility that she may not have been alone, even if no second individual was clearly visible on the footage. As the investigation developed, behavioral analysts were brought in. These specialists examine patterns, how a person lives, how they make decisions, and what deviations from those patterns might indicate. According to one analyst, Nancy's disappearance did not align with voluntary behavior. There were no signs of planning. No indication that she intended to leave. No communication suggesting distress or preparation. In cases like this, investigators typically consider 3 primary possibilities. Voluntary disappearance. A medical or psychological event. Or involvement by another individual. Early on, officials began to quietly shift away from the first 2. This was based on evidence, not assumption. Her phone, for example, remained near her residence for a period of time before activity stopped. It was not immediately turned off, but it also did not show normal usage after a certain point. That kind of pattern often suggests interruption. Now consider the home itself. At first, nothing appeared out of place. But according to later reports, a closer forensic review identified something that had not been immediately obvious. Trace evidence. More specifically, biological material. According to investigators, DNA was identified inside Nancy Guthrie's home that did not match her and did not match anyone known to be associated with her. Think about that. In a private residence, unknown DNA is not automatically unusual. But in the context of a missing person case, where there are no signs of forced entry, it becomes a different kind of detail. Because it raises a question. How did it get there? And more importantly, when? This is where the case begins to change. Investigators did not immediately release this information publicly. According to reports, the evidence was processed through standard forensic procedures, including verification and comparison against known profiles. That process takes time. But once the presence of unidentified DNA was confirmed, the focus of the investigation began to narrow. Now here's where things shift. Instead of looking only at Nancy's movements, investigators began examining the possibility that someone else had been inside the home during a critical window of time. That shift matters. Because it changes the nature of the case. Around the same period, law enforcement activity increased in areas surrounding Nancy's residence. Officers began canvassing locations that did not initially appear directly connected. Then came the operation. According to reports, a coordinated law enforcement response unfolded approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. Multiple units, including SWAT vehicles and deputies, moved into a residential neighborhood. A man and a woman were detained from inside a house. A third individual was stopped and detained during a nearby traffic stop. Sources indicate the timing of those actions was deliberate. Investigators reportedly waited until the traffic stop was in place before approaching the residence. Now think about that. That suggests coordination. Planning. A sequence designed to control multiple points at once. Within a short period, additional personnel arrived on scene, including federal agents. The area was secured, and evidence collection began. But here's the part that raised questions. Law enforcement did not immediately confirm how this operation was connected to Nancy Guthrie's case. They did not state whether the individuals detained were suspects, witnesses, or persons of interest. And they did not confirm whether the DNA evidence played a direct role in initiating the operation. That lack of clarity matters. Because it leaves a gap between two critical developments. The discovery of unidentified DNA inside Nancy's home. And a coordinated law enforcement operation just miles away. This is where investigators begin to work from possibility rather than conclusion. One possibility is that the DNA identified a new individual, someone not previously connected to Nancy. Another possibility is that it pointed toward a location or contact that required immediate attention. But at this stage, those connections have not been publicly confirmed. What has been confirmed is this. The case remains active. Officials have stated that evidence is still being analyzed. Statements are still being reviewed. And the timeline is still being refined. Because even with the forensic discovery and the law enforcement response, there are still unanswered questions. Questions about timing. Questions about presence. And questions about how those two pieces, evidence and action, fit together. So the question becomes simple, but difficult. If unidentified DNA was found inside Nancy Guthrie's home, and a coordinated operation followed shortly after, what exactly connects those two events? That is where this case continues. By the time the SWAT operation concluded, investigators were no longer focused on where Nancy Guthrie might be. That question had already begun to shift. Now the focus was on something else. What had happened inside the home before she disappeared, and who else may have been there? According to investigators, once the unknown DNA was identified, the next step was not immediate action. It was verification. This is where things become more technical. Forensic evidence, especially DNA, goes through multiple stages before it can influence an investigation. It must be collected properly, preserved without contamination, and analyzed through certified laboratories. Each step is documented, reviewed, and compared against known profiles. That process does not move quickly. But when it produces a result, especially one that does not match anyone associated with the residence, it changes the direction of the case. Now here's what matters. The presence of unidentified DNA does not automatically confirm a crime. There are situations where trace evidence can be explained by prior contact, secondary transfer, or even environmental factors. But in this case, investigators reportedly treated the finding as significant. Why? Because it appeared in a context that did not align with the initial assumptions about Nancy's disappearance. At the same time, law enforcement began revisiting the timeline they had already constructed. Every detail was re-examined. Her last known movements. The delay near her vehicle. The absence of communication. The location of her phone. All of it was now being viewed through a different lens. This is where things begin to change again. Instead of asking only what Nancy did, investigators began asking who else could have interacted with her during that narrow window of time. That shift led them outward. According to reports, officers expanded their review of surveillance footage beyond the immediate area of Nancy's home. Cameras along nearby roads, businesses, and intersections were analyzed again, this time with a specific question in mind. Was there any indication of another individual or vehicle present during that critical period? At first, nothing stood out. But then, according to sources familiar with the case, a detail that had previously been considered minor began to draw attention. A vehicle. The footage was not clear enough to immediately identify it. But the timing placed it within the same general window as Nancy's last confirmed movement. Now think about that. On its own, a passing vehicle means very little. But when aligned with a missing person timeline, and a later discovery of unknown DNA, it becomes something investigators cannot ignore. This is where pattern analysis becomes central. Investigators look for repetition, movement, direction. They compare multiple camera angles, even if the images are incomplete. And sometimes, a partial match is enough to justify further action. Now consider the SWAT operation again. Authorities have not publicly confirmed what led them to that specific house. But according to reports, the individuals detained were believed to be connected in some way. Not necessarily as suspects, but as people who may have information relevant to the case. That distinction is important. Because in many investigations, early detentions are not about charges. They are about access, to statements, to devices, to environments that may contain evidence. This is where things become more controlled. Once individuals are detained, investigators can begin structured interviews. These are not casual conversations. They are designed to establish timelines, identify inconsistencies, and gather details that can be cross-referenced with existing evidence. According to sources, those interviews began shortly after the operation. But here's the issue. At this stage, law enforcement has not publicly released the content of those interviews. They have not confirmed whether the individuals provided useful information. And they have not stated whether any direct link to Nancy has been established. That lack of information is not unusual. In active investigations, details are often withheld to protect the integrity of the process. Releasing too much too soon can influence statements, alert other individuals, or compromise evidence. But it also leaves a gap. A gap between what happened, and what is known. Now here's what investigators are working with. They have a timeline that includes an unexplained delay near Nancy's home. A complete absence of communication after a certain point. The discovery of unknown DNA inside her residence. And a coordinated law enforcement operation involving multiple individuals. Each of these elements is significant on its own. But together, they create a pattern that does not yet have a single explanation. This is where investigative theory begins to form. Not as a conclusion, but as a framework. One possibility is that someone entered Nancy's home during that critical window, either by invitation or without resistance, and that interaction led to an outcome that disrupted her normal routine. Another possibility is that the DNA is unrelated, and that the timeline gap is connected to a separate event entirely. But there is a problem with that. Because both explanations require assumptions that investigators have not confirmed. This is why they return to the evidence. Again and again. Now consider the digital side. Nancy's phone activity stopped within a defined period. According to investigators, there were no outgoing calls, no messages, and no attempts to access services after that point. That kind of silence is difficult to explain. Even in situations involving stress or confusion, individuals typically attempt some form of communication. The absence of that raises questions. And those questions extend beyond Nancy. Because if another person was involved, their presence would need to align with that same timeline. This is where data comparison becomes critical. Phone records from nearby towers. Movement patterns from vehicles. Time stamps from surveillance systems. Each piece is examined not just individually, but in relation to the others. Looking for overlap. Looking for alignment. Looking for something that connects. Now here's the key issue. So far, investigators have not publicly confirmed a single narrative that explains all of these elements together. Not the DNA. Not the vehicle. Not the detentions. That is why the case remains open. And that is why the next phase becomes even more important. Because once initial evidence is collected and early interviews are conducted, investigators move into a deeper level of analysis. They begin verifying not just what happened, but what could not have happened. Eliminating possibilities. Refining the timeline. Testing each theory against the facts. Until only one version remains that fits every detail. At this point, that version has not been confirmed. Which leads to a different kind of question. If the evidence is still being aligned, and the connections are still being tested, then what exactly did investigators see that justified a coordinated operation involving multiple individuals? And how does that decision connect back to what was found inside Nancy Guthrie's home? That is where the investigation now turns. In the days following the operation, investigators shifted into a phase that is less visible, but often more decisive. Verification. Not just of the evidence they had already collected, but of how each piece fit into the larger sequence of events. Because at this stage, the case was no longer about gathering information. It was about testing it. According to officials, the focus turned to alignment. Physical evidence. Digital records. Personal statements. All three needed to match. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, they did not fully match. Now here's what matters. When investigators encounter inconsistencies, they do not immediately assume deception. There are other explanations: stress, confusion, incomplete recall. But those possibilities still have to be measured against the evidence. That process takes time. And it requires repetition. Statements are reviewed again. Timelines are reconstructed again. Data is cross-checked again. Looking for consistency. Or the lack of it. This is where the interviews become more structured. According to reports, individuals connected to the operation were questioned more than once. Initial conversations are often broad, designed to establish a baseline. Follow-up interviews are more precise. They focus on details. Timing. Movement. Interaction. Even small differences can matter. Because when a statement changes, investigators need to understand why. Now consider the DNA again. By this point, forensic teams would have moved beyond identification. The next step is comparison. Databases. Known profiles. Potential matches. According to standard procedure, unidentified DNA is run through national systems where possible, looking for any connection to known individuals. But that process does not always produce immediate results. And when it does not, investigators are left with a different kind of challenge. They know the DNA exists. They know it does not match the expected profiles. But they do not yet know who it belongs to. That creates a gap. And that gap becomes central to the investigation. This is where things begin to narrow. Instead of looking at broad possibilities, investigators begin focusing on specific windows of time and location. Where could that DNA have been transferred? When could another individual have been inside the home? And how does that align with Nancy's last known movements? These are not simple questions. Because they require every piece of evidence to support the same sequence. Now here's the issue. The timeline still contains a gap. Nancy's last confirmed movement is documented. The absence of communication is documented. The location of her belongings is documented. But what happens between those points is still not fully established. That gap is where all current theories exist. One theory suggests that an interaction occurred inside the home, one that introduced the unidentified DNA and disrupted Nancy's routine. Another suggests that the DNA may be unrelated to the disappearance, and that the key event happened elsewhere. But both theories face the same challenge. They must explain every known detail. Not just one. This is why investigators return to the same questions. Again and again. Now consider the area where the operation took place. Following the initial detentions, that location was re-examined. Not for immediate evidence, but for context. Movement patterns. Entry and exit points. Visibility from surrounding properties. According to reports, investigators were attempting to determine whether that location could connect back to Nancy's timeline. Not through assumption, but through measurable factors. Distance. Travel time. Possible routes. Think about that. If an individual moved between Nancy's home and that location, the timing would need to align with everything else already established. And if it does not, that connection becomes less likely. This is how possibilities are eliminated. Slowly. Methodically. Now here's what has not been confirmed. Law enforcement has not announced any charges. They have not publicly identified any suspects. And they have not provided a final explanation for the sequence of events. That tells you something important. The case has not reached a conclusion. It has reached a point where the evidence is still being tested. And until it produces a consistent narrative, the investigation remains open. At the same time, officials have indicated that analysis is ongoing. Forensic work continues. Digital data continues to be reviewed. And follow-up interviews continue to be conducted. Because even a small detail can change the direction of the case. A timestamp that aligns. A statement that confirms movement. A piece of data that connects two previously unrelated elements. That is how cases like this are resolved. Not through a single discovery, but through the accumulation of consistent evidence. Now consider the position investigators are in. They have a confirmed disappearance. They have unexplained DNA inside a private residence. They have a coordinated operation involving multiple individuals. And they have a timeline that does not yet fully account for all of it. That combination leaves only one conclusion. Not about what happened, but about what has not yet been determined. There is still a missing piece. And until that piece is identified, the case cannot be closed. So the question remains. If the evidence continues to be analyzed, and the connections are still being tested, then what detail, small or overlooked, has the potential to bring all of this into alignment? Because whatever that detail is, it is the one thing investigators are still trying to find. If you want more breakdowns like this, you can subscribe. But more importantly, based on everything you've heard, what do you think connects the DNA, the timeline, and the operation?